Well, I'm grateful to be able to release the second video in the 5-part trauma series. And this is going to be about trauma and racial conditioning. And today, what we're going to talk about is how we get conditioned at a neurological level, but really in an implicit way. In other words, we can't see it, it's unconscious. And there are certain blind spots that each and every one of us have. I have blind spots. You have blind spots. We all have blind spots. And what that requires is a certain level of humility. I think right now, a little humility would go a long way. And I mean a long way. I had 3 conversations today, literally, as I'm recording this video, 3 conversations that were sort of based in racial tension. And people are reaching out and they're wanting to talk through, okay, I don't want to be divisive, but I have this viewpoint and I need to talk through it because I don't want to make the problem worse. I think a lot of people don't know how to make it better, but they're really afraid of making it worse. But there's a lot of tension. And so what I want to do today is I really want to talk about how these biases are conditioned into us. You know, I'm going to do another video, probably actually on part 5, we're going to talk through how to reconcile. And I think that's a great place to talk about the reconditioning process. But honestly, you can't talk about reconditioning until you can understand and have a conversation about how something is conditioned in the first place. If you're looking for this to be a video that you can use to build some sort of political stance, this is not going to be the video for you. This video is not going to be focused on classism. It's not going to be focused on economics. This video is focused on the trauma that all of us have experienced, specifically in the different groups. So the Black community, the dominant community, and also law enforcement. This video is focused on the underlying conditioning and the underlying biases and how they're formed. And that's the conversation that I see missing. Again, there's a lot of great videos out there, great videos on politics, great videos on economics and crime and all of that. Those are fine. What I'm saying that I actually haven't seen a lot of is this engaged on a different level, a deeper level. And I think this is the conversation that we need to find a way to have, that we really don't know how to have, and we haven't really known that we've needed to have it. You know, I think about just for a moment the idea of the church being a place that honestly people are looking to for answers. People are looking at the church and they're wanting to see if we're getting it right or we have anything figured out. But when you look at the church, when you look at a lot of Christian churches, and I'll even stretch it across the denominational spectrum, you do not find that the majority of churches really have answers to this. This is incredibly tumultuous, and a lot of people are struggling for answers. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to start with the Black community. And when I think of how people term this, right, as far as the expectations and the frustrations within the Black community, I think for a lot of people, so I'm going to just kind of go out and assess this from a dominant perspective, right, for just a moment. I think what it looks like is that many in the Black community, number one, aren't healing. They're not getting over it. They're not moving on. There's no path forward. And it just continues to be the same old, same old. And what I continue to see is this growing resentment. People look at the Black community and they see a ton of hypocrisy, and it just looks like a growing threat. And one of the biggest concerns is that in the Black community, there's no objectivity. And people are looking at the Black community and they're wanting to know where are the people who are going to be grounded, where are the people who are bringing facts, where are the people who are bringing logic, where are the people who are bringing an intelligent argument, and people are wanting to see consistency and so on. And it's really easy, again, to look at the Black community. And I say Black community is very, very expansive. It's a very general definition, obviously. But they're wanting to know, why isn't this different? Why isn't this further? Why aren't there more people who are more healed? And I want to address that through how the brain works. I want to address it in terms of the deeper psychology, but also the wiring. You've heard where neurons fire together, they what? They wire together. And then the Black community, trauma has been one of these experiences, collective experiences, that is now just being talked about and accepted. And to some degree, specifically, I mean, the Black community, and which I am a part of, is an interesting historical case study of massive amounts of trauma in a longitudinal sense, right? Throughout time. Unfortunately, there's a lack of resources and, more importantly, awareness about how to heal from it, which is what I'm so passionate about. Mental health, depression, anxiety, these types of things in the Black community have been termed a certain way and have actually been labeled a certain way. So we're actually having to have those conversations for many for the first time. So what I want to do is I want to start with how the brain works, and then we're going to start with how that works in the Black community, and then what we're going to do is we're going to build on that. What are the outworkings based off of how the brain has been affected by trauma in the Black community? And then we're going to do the same thing with the dominant group. How has what we've seen in terms of law enforcement conditioned what we see in the Black community and also in the dominant community? What I'm going to do in order to explain the brain is I'm going to take the approach seen in The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he is a leading researcher when it comes to trauma, when it comes to how the body is affected by trauma. And I think that's very important. We have to look at how the brain and the body are affected. Many of us have heard of the amygdala, the limbic system. It's sort of at the heart of the limbic system. And the amygdala is the smoke detector. In other words, it's what helps us to get into alert mode when we need to get there. Then you have the thalamus. The thalamus is sort of like the filter. It's what preps information for the amygdala. The thalamus is what connects us to the outside world. It's where we experience, right, where all of our sensations come in, right? You think about our five senses, right? The thalamus is what connects the outside world with our internal experience. So the thalamus is connected to our external experience. It brings in information. Van der Kolk calls it the cook or the filter, and it filters information depending on how it's fed, but it brings information to the amygdala. Once it brings information to the amygdala determines the significance of what it's fed, and then it does one of two things. It goes the high road or the low road. Depending on how it's fed, it will go the high road, which means that whatever information that's been received by the amygdala, it's now going to send that to the hippocampus, and where it receives a little bit of help in terms of being categorized, right? The hippocampus is important in terms of categorization. And then we see it go up the chain to the prefrontal cortex, right? And there's different parts of the prefrontal cortex that we'll get to in just a moment. When it gets to the prefrontal cortex, it's going to get processed. It's going to be integrated. It's going to be put in terms of its context. And then what can happen is that our prefrontal cortex can send messages to the amygdala that, you know what, you're okay. There's no threat. The low road is very different. We get information from the thalamus, depending on what the information is and how well the thalamus is functioning. And now it comes to the amygdala, and let's say our brain goes into threat. What then happens is the amygdala says, you know what? I'm going to set off the smoke alarm. We're going to create arousal in the body. And then what happens is the hypothalamus puts the whole body on alert. And we see one of the impulse states. In other words, when you see people react before they can think, that's what's happened is that the amygdala is triggering a stress response for safety within our body. John Gottman, he's done some really good research in terms of marriage therapy. He has a very helpful concept that's called flooding. And it's when our prefrontal cortex gets overwhelmed and is really, in this case, out of the loop. It's kept out of the loop in terms of what's going on in our body. I want you to think about on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you're absolutely calm, 10 being you're absolutely out of your mind, overwhelmed. Like we're talking about the max of what overwhelm would look like. Flooding is typically going to be around, let's say, a 6. Again, a 6 is when your amygdala is telling the rest of your body that you need to react versus calm down. And the stress responses that we see are very predictable. You have fight, flight, freeze, attach, and then submit. When it comes to the prefrontal cortex, Van der Kolk has a very helpful way of thinking through what's going on up here when it's actually going right. We have the watchtower. That is what helps us to make a determination that, you know what, I'm safe. Things are okay. I don't need to overreact. I don't need to become aggressive. I don't need to flee. I don't need to do any of those things. And it really kind of helps to regulate the rest of our body and helps to keep us out of those impulse states. Then you have the timekeeper. This is what, so the last video, we kind of talked a little bit about this idea of what trauma does. It disorients you from knowing not just where you are, but when you are, because your senses are not reliable. It orients us in terms of when we are. So for people who are reliving, let's say you have a trauma, some trigger happens, it comes in through your thalamus. It then shoots to your amygdala. Now we keep the timekeeper and the watchtower are kept out of it. And it goes straight to the hypothalamus, and stress hormones are going to be sent. We have no way of knowing if what we're feeling is actually connected to reality. Very important. And number two, our sense of time is now lost. In other words, when you're stuck in reliving, you feel like that moment lasts forever. You think of when people experience trauma, and I have many people that I've worked with, there's almost a slowing down that happens. And your brain really starts to take it. I mean, you have neurotransmitters, you have neurochemicals that are firing like crazy, and they are recording every detail, which is what gets relived, which is part of what's so debilitating for people. Because they don't just have to really relive the worst part of it, they have to relive the intensity regarding the worst part of it. So this is part of that aspect when people go through trauma, that they lose their ability to say that it's over. Again, our brain wants to create a beginning, middle, and an end. Without the right and left medial prefrontal cortex, you don't have an ability to have the beginning, middle, and especially the end. You don't have a timestamp for that. I think for most people, when they look at situations outside of the context of trauma, you're going to be very unsuccessful and you're going to be very frustrated. You're going to find that things don't add up. And then you think about the long-term health effects. The ACE study done years ago, it didn't just show that trauma was something that affects the brain alone. Trauma is something that affects a person's longevity in terms of their lifespan, right? Trauma, and you have to think about it like a co-occurring, those in the mental health community, you know what co-occurring means. So if someone has a mental health issue and they have an addiction, right? We call that co-occurring. When it comes to trauma, trauma is co-occurring in terms of a medical diagnosis as well. What we find is not just those in the Black community, but overall, trauma increases all sorts of hormones within the body, and over time deteriorates the resiliency within our body at a physiological level. You're finding that those in the Black community, because of the trauma that has been experienced that has not been resolved, are not just suffering in terms of the quality of life, the stress response, cortisol, so forth like that. In the immediacy, we're talking about shorter lifespans overall. This is not just something that affects us mentally. This is something that for many people is actually cutting their life short. I think one of the frustration points for many in the dominant group, and I would say that if you're in the dominant group, there are people within the Black community that feel similarly. In other words, it's not just about color, it's about perspective. In other words, someone who is in the Black community can think like someone in the white community. There are people in the Black community that very much look down on people who've been traumatized and so forth. And it's not like you have to be outside of that group to have some real questions or to be frustrated. I think those in the Black community are equally frustrated as well. I think one of the things that's very frustrating is, why does everything seem to come back to race? Dr. Tanya Sharp, in her research, has actually coined a very helpful term, and she talks about that those in the Black community have a race-based structural inequality lens. Now, I want you to think, again, the narrative. I want you to just sort of follow the narrative with me, and then we're going to talk brain science, and we'll just see if it starts to make a little bit more sense. Again, I really want to be integrated in our understanding. If you are someone in the Black community, think about the messages that you are given. From birth, being a young child and adolescent, think about how hard you're told that you're going to have to work by those raising you. And maybe it's not your mom and your dad. Maybe it's your aunt. Maybe it's your uncle. Maybe it's a grandparent, right? Maybe it's someone in the village, right? Because those in the African American community oftentimes are raised by people outside of their nuclear family. The conditioning that many people in the African American community are told about how hard you're going to have to work, how hard it is, how much you're going to have to survive, you're going to have all these forces, you're going to have people who are going to try to hold you down. And so the hope for those raising children is that it's going to alert them to how hard they're going to have to work, that it's going to increase their resiliency, it's going to prepare them for this really difficult world. And those messages get stored, those messages get internalized. You get indoctrinated about how hard you're going to have to work in a world that's primarily white and is not going to treat you fair. And then all of a sudden, let's say around college, someone is supposed to now all of a sudden not have that worldview. They're not supposed to think that way anymore, especially if they've had confirmatory experiences along the way that support that. In my family, it was you have to work twice as hard to look half as good. And there are many sayings. When you think about that race-based structural inequality lens, it's something that those in the Black community do to prepare the offspring and those who are going to supersede them. But it's also kind of a survival indoctrination sort of mechanism that can create a little bit of what we talked about as far as when you find something in your environment, it gets overdeveloped, it kind of gets misappraised. There's many different reasons for that. Part of it is the narrative. Part of it is when you are someone of color, you're likely, the likelihood of you experiencing someone being racist towards you directly or indirectly is very, very high. That helps that bias, it helps to reinforce that narrative. And that's a survival narrative. One of the most humiliating aspects of being oppressed and being traumatized is missing developmental milestones, right? You already feel inferior, but then to admit that there are probably some milestones that you didn't get. I think for me, a couple of things that I know that I didn't get is I didn't have that family structure. And so that really disconnected me in terms of school and confidence. And I wasn't able to make good decisions as far as who I was selected from my friend group. My ability to be responsible, my ability to be accountable and to accept authority. I really struggled with many of those things. I really struggled with being honest. And again, I missed developmental milestones partly as a result of my family system breakdown, but there were also developmental milestones that were missed because being a part of the Black community means that there is more brokenness in terms of family structure. I've had to go back and do developmental repair, which means I've had to be honest about what got missed. I've had to be honest about what hasn't happened. You know, when you think about affirmative action and things like that, again, that political sort of vehicle for equality, I want to put that over here for a moment. What I want to address at a psychological level, there are real deficits that need to be healed. There are real deficits that need to be repaired. In other words, people need to be built. And I can assure you that at this point in my life, if I hadn't had great people and an amazing God and an amazing sort of community of faith to help fill in those developmental mispoints within me, there's no way I would have been able to pull it together as far as school and grow and be built, be supported. None of that would have ever happened. It would have never made sense to give me something when at a fundamental level I was missing certain aspects. And it takes humility, but it also takes some courage. Those in the Black community, one of the things that we have to do, we have to drop the pretenses that we maybe have it all figured out or have it all together. And that inferiority with people you trust has to be workshopped. Otherwise, you'll never actually be qualified for the things that at some point you would very much end up deserving and actually be given. I do believe to some extent we are in a day where if you are growing on the inside, and I'm not saying there isn't inequality, but if you are putting the work in and you're running to get those milestones filled, I can almost assure you that there will be opportunities for you and you will not regret it, but you have to be honest. And I think this is something in the dominant group in terms of affirmative action and so forth that creates resentment. And I just want to do some ownership. But with that comes a privilege. I now have a responsibility. And I think if you're in the Black community, you don't just have the ability to ascend and evolve and elevate yourself. You also have a responsibility. with the privilege and with the benefits that you now have as someone who is educated. The research is clear with SAT scores. Specifically, there's a study done by Aronson and Steele. What they did is they had white kids and black kids take an SAT exam. And what they did on the first one is they actually labeled it as a test of intelligence. And there was a marked difference between the scores between those in the white group and the black group. Then what they do is they actually switched it and they labeled it task unrelated to intelligence. And the scores were almost identical. Now you think about that labeling for a moment. Now what I want us to do is I actually want to go back to the brain science that we were looking at earlier. Remember how the thalamus is the cook, basically the gatekeeper or the filter between us and the world around us? I want you to think about how now all of a sudden, if this is a test of intelligence and the stereotype threat that exists in many of the young minds in the black community, if this is a test of intelligence, you think about how much pressure that creates, just that label itself. The thalamus now all of a sudden sort of selectively filters it. Now it's filtered to the amygdala. Remember that smoke detector? It's looking for certain things in its environment to increase arousal around. Now what the amygdala does is it sends stress hormones into the body. And what those stress hormones do is they keep the prefrontal cortex offline. I'm pretty sure you need your prefrontal cortex to be online when you take something as robust as the SAT. I get that those in the dominant group might say, okay, I don't know what to tell you. It's the world we live in. Here's part of what I'm saying with this. I'm not saying we need to change everything necessarily to accommodate every aspect of everything that we see in the black community. What I'm saying is we need to have redirected resources to help children with the anxiety that's as a result of the stereotype threat. This is real, and what it does is ultimately it gets the body to arouse in a dysfunctional way that doesn't allow for a child to do well on a test. And so we have to deal with that. I'm not saying we change the test. I'm saying that we redirect our resources within helping that child. And they've actually found that when it comes to those labels, that it can trigger a physiological response. Again, that's not really a news flash when we think about how the brain works. Sports Illustrated did a little bit of, I think it was probably an informal survey. And they surveyed 2,000 kids as far as what they wanted to be when they grew up. And what they found was that a disproportionate number of children in the black community chose professional sports. Now, again, we know that professional sports, that's a great occupation, pays well, but we're dealing with less than 1% who actually make it there. And we know that there are tons of statistical odds against the person. Again, those were disproportionate in comparison to the Hispanic and the Caucasian community. We can see that this is something that's real. I understand those in the dominant group, they're going to say, well, what do we just change everything to accommodate? I just want you to know that we make test accommodations for those who have learning disabilities. We make test accommodations for those who need more time. We make test accommodations for those who need tests taken in a different room. Many of you may have children that require some of those accommodations. What I'm saying is we're learning, and as we continue to research it, we need to not just help people to perform well in terms of their environment, but also instilling something in them that's clearly missing.